Alhamdulillah wahdahu, amma ba'du. Recalling the considerations we discussed in the previous lecture about the profound hold the Greek tradition still enjoys on the Western process of theory making, even in aspects concerning knowledge itself and how we obtain it, one can easily see the historical reason why philosophers of science suffered an age-old debate between what is roughly called the scientific realist approach or scientific realism and what is called the anti-realist or anti-realism approach. Simply put, it's the question of whether or not the ontology of unseen things proposed in scientific theory is actually real, actually exists out there in reality, outside of the mind, or not. I contend that this debate exists in Western philosophy because of the ancient Greek notion of a theory and what epistemic function it is supposed to play. The founding fathers of the Greek Academy, and consequently the Western Academy as a whole, somehow believed that once a brilliant philosopher managed to propose some analogy or metaphor that describes all of existence, how it happens, what categories are there of existing things, why anything at all happens when it does, what is necessarily true of existing things, what is possible, what is impossible, in terms of being, of attributes and meanings that can be ascribed to them, he could then positively learn about all that may or may not exist in the world and beyond based on that one supernaturally revealing analogy. Now, originally, none of the pre-Socratic philosophers thought that such outrageous theories about existence, coexistence, and the categories and the categories of existing things needed any a posteriori experience of any sort to confirm it or to validate it or whatever. Of course, no induction could be enough to do the job, since, again, the theory is about all that can be described as existing in reality. All of it. Everything and anything at all. So obviously, when such is the subject matter of your theory, it would be irrational to even begin to assume validation or confirmation through empirical means. Okay? And ancient Greek philosophers were smart enough to recognize the sheer limitedness of the collective human experience in this world, and they thought that their minds could overcome that. And yet this did not discourage them. So this did not discourage them one bit from taking it as a job, as the job of a philosopher to theorize about all reality and all things that exist or can exist in reality. They really believed that their minds could make up for that limitedness. Why? Because they believed that their minds can and indeed should reveal all the knowledge there is to obtain about reality, sparing no room for prophets and religious preachers to tell people about unseen deities and the reward they promise the believers in another world that is yet to come after this world. Obviously, the reason any religious follower submits to those preachers and religious leaders, the reason they enjoy their social and political stature, the social and political powers in the nation, is because of the belief their followers have in those unseen things that they teach about, and the way that the belief determines pretty much everything that a believer should or should not do with their lives. So what better or more effective way to pull the rug from under those authoritative teachers and figures of religion altogether than to convince their followers that the mind or reason as such can indeed provide an entirely different worldview than the one they are taught at the temple, and that the other view is indeed what rational contemplation and proper scholarly thought about existence leads to. Okay? What better way to defeat them than do that? What more effective way to defeat those leaders than to convince their followers that unless they think in exactly the same manner, that scholarly manner as they would have, or academic manner, they would only be blind followers who have been fooled by charlatans who have no rational grounds to offer for the teachings. It had to be established thus that either you theorize about reality or existence as such, okay, and thereby see for yourself whether or not a deity, any deity, can in fact exist, and if at all, can have such attributes as to make it a person that can reveal teachings to people and reward them after the death, or you remain a mere blind follower who just follows what is commonly believed with no critical thinking in any way, shape, or form. And while pagan beliefs of the Greeks, common at the time, were generally irrational and untenable, of course, this was true of them not because they lacked the premises needed to establish the possibility or the necessity of the existence of anything beyond this world to be responsible for such teachings coming to earth. No sane, reasonable, sensible human being needs such premises to know that we are all, in fact, creatures spawned into a created world by an almighty maker who made it all for a purpose. The pagans were rational because they ascribed aspects of absolute lordship, صفات الربوبية, to creatures like themselves and engaged in acts of worship that, that would clearly imply that. They were rational because they claimed partners in divinity unto their one maker, when they knew, as a matter of self-evident fact, that he can only be he can only be one and single. He can have no partners in creating or sustaining this world. None of these facts requires theoretical premises to establish in one's mind, and that's precisely why those of them who do hear the messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be given no pardon on the day of judgment if they still insist on dying on such beliefs. There's not going to be a philosophical debate on that day, brothers and sisters. Polytheists would not be able to deny the magnitude of their offense against their Lord. And when philosophers stand to be judged, they would not be able to say, like Bertrand Russell once arrogantly claimed that he would say, if he ever did meet with God, sorry sir, not enough evidence. No, they wouldn't be able to say that. On that day, even your limbs would be given the capacity to testify against you if need be. You wouldn't be able to deny those sparse moments in your life when you did in fact see the falsity and futility of your ways, refusing, nevertheless, in sheer arrogance to openly admit that and to make the one choice you knew in your heart of hearts you had to make, and you knew that it was the only truth. You can hide your thoughts, your impulses, your feelings, and your heartly inclinations and the true inner motives behind everything you ever said or did, behind every argument and every rationalization trick you claim to actually convince you and others around you that your path is right. You can hide all that from fellow humans like yourself, but you cannot hide anything from the one who made you. The one who gave you that capacity in your mind, the one who sees what's inside you, who sees you inside out, so to speak. You can't hide anything at all from such a being. It's all coming out on that day, every little bit of it. You will be reminded of things that happened at the bottom of your subconsciousness, things you so often overlooked and never bothered to take seriously or to think about twice. Things that used to ring the bell of truth over and over again within your tired and overstretched mind. You will not be arguing against a peer on that day who can be fooled potentially by your wordplay and your sophist tricks and the things that made you so revered among human people, among your human followers. But then again, it all goes down to that sheer arrogance that originally blocked their souls from embracing the truth. Such arrogance that will come alive on that day and there will be no denying it. The point is, brothers and sisters, that the ancient Greeks sabotaged the very notion of reason and what it means to make sense of the world and of reality as such. And they did that on purpose out of that very same arrogance I referred to just now. How can the Lord choose those people unto us? How can He tell me, being who I am, to follow those people if I wish to earn salvation for myself after I die? How can He choose to give them such an existential privilege over someone like me, to such an extent that I actually have to be a total follower of them or of the one that they're following, rather than have everybody follow me and reveal me as I desire? Why did He not reveal to me what He chose to reveal to them? Why not choose me to be the prophet and the messenger that everybody has to no choice but to follow? This is what it comes down to, brothers and sisters. It's the actual feeling and heartly inclination that will be revealed to them on the day of judgment, and they would not be able to deny it. Why him and not me, on the seat of universal mastery over all other humans? Why was he chosen, not me, to reveal the most important of all truths and to deliver the most important message to ever be delivered to other people? This is why it had to be shown that if any true revelation is to be sought at all, it is to be found in the minds of philosophers, nowhere else. Okay, this is the quasi-religious origin of the way that the Greeks used to think of their minds and their capacities and of the function of theory and of all philosophy. Okay, we the philosophers are the few enlightened individuals who have finally acquired minds that are powerful enough to reveal the truth of all things and to show other people what is really out there, out of the allegorical cave. We don't need to actually go out of the cave and look around to tell those poor people stranded inside what the world outside is really like. All we have to do is think hard enough, and reason would reveal all that there is to be revealed to us. Reason alone would salvage our minds and our souls. Reason alone. Okay, this is why I insisted in previous lectures that there can be no meaningful separation between philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism, brothers and sisters. They are both the inevitable outcome of the Greek notion of what the mind does when it thinks about existence, and thereby what a theory is and what it is supposed to be like. Okay, what kinds of meanings it's supposed to address and how to address them. To counter the claims of religious leaders, it had to be maintained that the mind can in fact acquire knowledge on its own about all that can exist in reality, both within the realm of our senses and our accumulated experience and beyond. Okay? If it merits the attribute of actual existence anywhere and at any time, then our minds should be able to establish that on the basis of some demonstrative premises in the form of a philosophical argument. It has to fall, one way or another, under one or more category of existing things, either in actuality or potentiality, as established in the theory. Okay? Such categories that would follow from an unwarranted universalization of some inductive analogy about how things of this world came to be, and how they merit, or how we see them come to be when they do come to be, and how they merit any of their attributes at all. The very fact that a philosopher would give himself the intellectual right or the prerogative to categorize all things that can exist outside of his mind reveals a hidden premise or presumption, a faith-based presumption, mind you, that all things are alike in their constitution and their fundamental nature. Which is what ultimately warrants the naturalistic approach to existence and reality. The reason why I, the philosopher, would trust my mind to be able to tell me if X can indeed exist, whatever that X may be, and if it can indeed have the attributes of happening in time or being in place with respect to other things, would be if I trust that in order for it to exist at all, to warrant the attribute existence and whatever meanings it entails, it has to be such that my theory of nature's composition and reasons why things are the way they are applies to it somehow. Otherwise, it cannot exist in reality at all. In other words, the theory needs to be built such that it explains why something, anything at all, would exist rather than not, and would exist in the exact way that it does exist, not in any other way. And if it does, why it would merit the meaning of happening in time, or being in time and in place or space or the like. Okay, it also follows from the very same theory. If my theory is such that it covers those basic necessary meanings for existing things, with some analogy that explains why anything at all would fall under them, then I would be able to refute all prophetic claims of a great beyond and of things that cannot be analogized in their nature or their essence في حقيقتها to anything that we observe of this world. By that, the philosopher would be able to cunningly establish the epistemic dominion of his mind over all existence. Epistemic dominion. Everything is fair game for theory, that is. Something can only be described as happening in time, whatever it is, if and only if it was built from fundamental detachable components. Principle, as can be observed in things we make and destroy in this world, day in, day out. Thereby can be theorized to have a similar existence, and to exist by merit of that similarity itself. Okay, something can only be described as being in place relative to something else if some substance that previously existed was altered or manipulated somehow for it to emerge from it, either by composition or alteration, as is the case with all of the things we see around us. So if all things are equal in their fundamental nature, and they have to be so he can actually tell us anything meaningful about them in his theory, then nature, which is the theoretical compendium of all things the natures of which are subject to his general theory, then nature must be all that exists or can exist. Okay, nature thus is all of reality, and that, brothers and sisters, is what is commonly known as philosophical naturalism. You see where it came from and how it emerged. Okay, and it is what justifies methodological naturalism as a method of thinking about things and explaining things. Alright, a method of spawning theories about different types of natures and observed causal regularities under that metaphysical assumption, that metaphysical doctrine. If you understand this properly, then you can clearly see why science, as is commonly defined today, has no epistemic boundaries whatever when it comes to exploring reality or learning about what actually exists. It is claimed as an intellectual right for a philosopher to postulate theories about all of reality, about the universe as the world in its totality is commonly termed in modern literature. No philosopher would stop for a moment to wonder if indeed there are any rational grounds for assuming that right to themselves, that intellectual right, the way they all do, because that's what the legacy of the founding academy in ancient Greece teaches them. Okay, that's what it means to be a philosopher. Ultimately, that's what they were taught a philosopher should do. Right. The fact that the academy was recently split in two, the physical academy, the one that deals with what is now currently called the science of physics, and its metaphysical sibling, the philosophy, the mainstream academy of philosophy, doesn't change the nature of the overall enterprise of the academy, the type of query it addresses, and the presumptions from which it all stems, and the general taxonomy of theories it leads to on both sides of that departmental divide. It's all the same. This is why there is, inevitably, metaphysics in scientific discourse as much as there is science in metaphysical discourse, with no meaningful or fruitful separation of the two. Okay? Because the so-called metaphysical theory is what provides the necessary rational grounding for a theory to address all of reality the way most theorists would do. Okay? Einstein did not start his revolution by contemplating in Newton's equations, or by inducing certain regularities of nature that were not at the time known to the academy. No, he started it by changing Newton's metaphysical definitions of time and space and gravitation, and by revisiting Galileo's notions of relative speed and of what he called an inertial frame. The ontology of these meanings was entirely cooked up in his mind, the new ontology of it, by means of thought experiments and the likes, as is commonly known, in the same manner that ancient Greek philosophers thought about the world and about those meanings. Okay, he started with pure metaphysical theory, following the Greek tradition in that aspect to the letter. Time to him, as to them, was not an abstract meaning, معنى كلي ذهني, that applies to things in reality in virtue of the way they relate to each other. No. It had to be some distinct entity in reality that gives temporal associations to all existing things that can be described as being in time or experiencing a flow of time in virtue of the compositional relation they have to that entity or that substance they called time. Okay. He believed that clocks told us the time by detecting the behavior of some physical entity that dilated or expanded in a moving reference frame as a universal law, a causal law, in order for the speed of light to remain absolutely constant, whether observed by someone in the moving frame or outside of it. Now, he later embraced the ontological characterization of time as an element or a component of the so-called space-time continuum, which is actually a geometrical representation of the space-time coordinate system by Hermann Minkowski, taking it to fill the place and do the function of what was formerly known as the ether. Okay, it was Minkowski's ontology originally, and Einstein simply ascribed to it. He liked it. The pervading substance that fills all of space. In metaphysical terms, the 19th century physicist would be compelled to say the ether has to exist everywhere, because nothing can be identified as being in a place or as having a relation of place to other things, i.e. being beside it or in front of it or above it or below it or near it or inside of it or outside of it, etc., without falling into that ether, without being inside that ether. It's also the same thing that Newton called absolute space 2 centuries earlier. The function of the ether in their ontology was to explain how anything at all can be observed, since it explains the propagation of light, and nothing can be seen without visible light. Okay, according to them, of course. It was also the medium for gravitation and all of motion. In some mystic sense, it was also supposed to explain or to actualize the entire mechanical system devised by Newton, in addition to the laws of electromagnetism by Maxwell and Faraday. If it happened at all, whatever it is, then only by virtue of having been within that pervading universal invisible substance, the ether, and being subject to its physical properties, whatever they were assumed to be, that it did happen at all. Only because it was there in that sea of matter, whatever it is, only because of that did it happen at all. In fact, Following the tradition, they would be required to go even further, maintaining that if it was indeed real at all, if it existed in reality outside of their minds, whatever it may be, then only because it falls unto the ether would that be the case. All right. The very existence of that thing, whatever it is, would be explained by the ether and the laws it forces unto matter. Somehow, the laws it enjoins upon them. The Greeks would commit the same fallacy of objectifying or substantivating abstract meanings like time, space, motion, and the like, thanks to the notion and function of theory in the tradition itself. That's where it comes from, brothers and sisters. That's where this common fallacy comes from. The job of the theorist who studies the natures of things is not just to examine how or why certain phenomena take place when they do, or why particular types of substance or matter have the natures and attributes that they do, and how they can be altered at will in technical terms. No. The job of the natural philosopher, as taught by the Greeks, was much bigger and far more ambitious than that. He tasked himself with revealing the natures of all things that exist in reality, and thereby explaining that all-encompassing entity we so tentatively call the world or the universe. His job, as he thought of it, was to explain reality as such. Things are real because the theory applies to them. Newton thus had to satisfy himself with the metaphor of a machine if he was to accomplish such a task. All things had to follow a simple set of laws that govern them as self-sufficiently as the gears of a machine would run it. Self-sufficiently in terms of causation. A machine does not normally need any input from outside in order for its function to be performed internally. Okay? That's where the metaphor of a machine comes from. That's why they call it mechanics. Okay? All things had to follow a simple set of laws that run like a machine. No external action required. After all, if all moving things only moved because those invisible forces inside, instilled in them by virtue of being in space, made them move, because those forces made them move, and the equations assimilated the patterns and regularities of those forces, then nothing external to those laws is required for the machine to work. As Laplace so famously retorted when he was addressing Napoleon about his book. Napoleon famously asked him, he said, "They tell me you have written this large book on the system of the universe and have never even mentioned its creator." And so Laplace responds famously, "I had no need for that hypothesis. I had no need of that hypothesis." The hypothesis? The creator is now a hypothesis? Subhanallah. This is how any cause for anything that happens within that machine, the cause for anything that happens within that machine, according to this notion, according to this understanding, can only be natural and can only follow these specific laws so that it would merit being called a cause at all. Nothing can be caused from outside of it or from a part of these laws. Everything that can be called real must be given this attribute, the attribute of existing in reality, in space, in time and space, because its nature is so and so, because it follows these laws, or because it is made up of so and so, as his universal ontology would assume, whatever it happens to be. Okay? It's the very explanation of things being real. This is why questions like why is there something rather than nothing would be tackled by starting from similar but rather simpler metaphysical questions, like in the case of Einstein's metaphysics, for example, why are things as such attracted to each other rather than repelled, or neither? Okay? As purely metaphysical as such questions obviously are, because by things they mean everything. Okay? As purely metaphysical as such questions obviously are, they cannot be viewed as something alien to the job of theoretical physicists according to the Greek tradition. After all, if the subject matter of physics as a discipline of theory is all of reality, then who's to blame a physicist for taking it unto himself to tell us why there is a world at all, teleologically of course, and why it is the way that it is rather than any other way, how it all came to be, if it did at all start to be, after it was not, and how it would eventually end if it is to be to have an ending at all. He is today the philosopher whose job is to work on all questions about the world at large, at its entirety. Okay? The metaphysical function of the so-called ether in pre-Einsteinian ontology was to provide the physical explanation for what Newton would call the absolute flow of time. time had to be thought of as the physical attribute of the ether. Okay, whatever that was, and how the mechanics of that invisible substance keeps everything in constant motion. It had to be thought of as the way that the mechanics of that invisible substance keeps, the reason why the mechanics of that invisible substance keeps everything in constant motion. It that happens because the ether exists, whatever that may be. Why? Because otherwise, we'd have to resort to other unseen, undemonstrable, unprovable, unaccessible from our tools, from our means and methods of reasoning, inaccessible causes beyond all that. Like, for example, the idea that angels move these things around. Okay, which is what people of the book used to believe, which what Christians and Jews used to believe, and had in their sacred texts. And earlier, before that, of course, there were other common reasons believed about unseen things. Earlier, Aristotle used to believe that there were glass spheres, major glass spheres that had those stars splattered on top of them everywhere, and they were fixed in place because of those spheres. Of course, he had never seen any such thing, but he had to make such a proposition to stop people from saying there had to be some supernatural, so to speak, reasons why these things are the way they are. There had to be, like the prophets would teach, there had to be some means that cannot be observed, that cannot be even theorized, that cannot be even imagined. Okay, why these things are the way they are, and we only just can't see them. They're invisible to us. Okay, so the theory has to reveal that. It has to come up with some analogy, any analogy, whatever, to something that we can hold in our hands. Okay, to describe and to explain how things are the way they are in the far away celestial things. Okay, far out of our reach. So if the stars are not fixed to some kind of a glass sphere, then what about assuming that they are swimming around or hanging around, submerged in some sea, infinite sea of something, of a substance that is out there that is called ether, and it's because of the properties of that substance that we are not yet quite familiar with, that we're not yet fully aware of, that these things are hanging the way they are. Okay, what did Einstein do? All he did was simply replace the concept of an ether with the concept of a space-time that was itself an ether, that was itself the sea, because of which gravitation takes place, and under which all the laws are being maintained in the universe. All right. The point is that there has to be such a major, unobservable, unbounded, untestable, okay, entity or substance in reality, somehow, some way, that plays that metaphysical function, that ontological function in their theory, one way or another. It has to be there. Okay, that's how the Greeks teach them how to do science, how to do theory about existence and about reality. It has to be assumed that something like that exists, and that's something, and that's the more important thing. That something has to be analogizable, has to be similar in its nature to things that we know, to things that we are familiar with in our everyday life. Okay, it has to be as such. All right, because this is the only way that he can claim that he has knowledge of what is out there and all that is out there and the natures of all things that can exist. Because the function of the theory itself is to explain all of reality, like we just pointed out. That's how the Greeks have it. That's how the Greeks would have it. We need to have that theory. We need to build the theory in order to be able to explain all of reality. And how can we do that if we don't have something by means of such an analogy, okay, that would tell us what is out there in the stars and beyond the stars and in all of existence? Okay, and because of it, that things are the way that they are somehow, and we would take our leisure in detailing such analogies and details as it comes, in order for the theory to be complete. All right, that's the lesson that they learned from the Greek Academy. So again, the metaphysical function of the so-called ether is, in pre-Einsteinian ontology, was to provide the physical explanation. The physical explanation. Okay, the fact that we call it physical or physics does not change the actual metaphysical nature of what the process of theory itself is like. Okay, so its function was to provide the physical explanation for what Newton would call the absolute flow of time. Time had to be thought of as the physical attribute, attribute of the ether, something that exists outside of the mind and can be observed in theory and in principle, and can be tested in principle, and can be controlled perhaps by causes and means that we may have one day. All right. Whatever that ether was, and how the mechanics of that invisible substance keep everything in constant motion, that was the job of the ether. And the theories that were then proposed about the properties of that so-called ether. Why? Because otherwise we wouldn't be able to consult a philosopher about how something, anything at all, merits the attribute of being in time, or being in place, or being in motion. Okay, that's the job of the ether, or anything like it, that philosophers would come up with to explain the way that things are moving, when they do move at all. Things, okay, anything that can actually be described as moving is the subject matter of the theory. Okay, and that's the central teaching that we are attacking here. Okay, unless the theory covers all such abstract meanings that relate to something being in place and in time and in motion, with some physical analogy that seems to work in describing that part of reality that we do experience in this world, then his job, in the Greek tradition, the job of the philosopher, would not have been fulfilled. What of the rest of the world, they would ask him. Okay, what does your theory tell us about that? There has to be a theory that tells us about all things, or else why bother? Okay, why bother? Come up with any theory at all. That's what the Greek Academy teaches. Newton wrote about time. He said, absolute, true, and mathematical time of itself and from its own nature flows equably without regard to anything external, and by another name is called duration, relative, apparent, and common time is some sensible and external, whether accurate or inequable, external measure of duration by the means of motion, which is commonly used instead of true time. Okay, so by virtue of absolute space being the physical arbiter and keeper of the absolute law of motion upon and ordainer of this law upon things, a keeper of law upon all things that exist within it, upon everything that can be described as existing somewhere. Okay, Newton believed or viewed it as absolute. Time itself had to be absolute, since all things are in constant motion relative to each other. So, if their constant motion is considered with respect to that absolute space that hosts everything within it, okay, in reference to it, then it can only be viewed as absolute itself. And time also has to be absolute. So time becomes somehow a physical attribute of that absolute space, one that flows steadily like a river in constant progression, regardless of how fast or slow anything that lies within that space may happen to be moving relative to something else. Now, one problem troubled Newton, though, probably more than it troubled most philosophers of that tradition before his time, namely the problem of God. We've shown, and will continue to show, that the Greek tradition was ultimately devised to achieve a state of epistemic self-sufficiency with respect to all questions about existence and reality. It basically teaches that all a philosopher ever needs to know anything about reality and existence would be his mind and his senses. All that he ever needs to know anything, to learn anything about reality and existence, would be his mind and his senses. That's all, that's it. That's the root to all knowledge. As long as he is smart enough and observant enough, he should be able to produce all knowledge about existing things, actually or potentially, on his own, from his couch. All right. Of course, most of them would not aspire to achieve omniscience, but most would muse that we could, and by we, I mean the entirety of humankind here, eventually come quite close to omniscience one day. Okay, so according to the tradition, if God or anything like God did in fact exist, then it is only through that route that any knowledge of his existence can be achieved. The theory of all existence has to be established first, loosely based on the philosopher's limited experience with the world, of course, such that it can be achieved, if at all, through reason, that such an entity does in fact exist, and thus it would follow from that theory itself what the foundations of any theology or knowledge of the divine should be like, his basic attributes, his relation to the world, as entailed from that theory. Okay? And since the Greek philosopher would never submit himself willingly to any religious tradition, regarding himself a follower of its leader, he would not mind leaving some room for God or some being like God in his theory, just as long as he follows the entailments of its naturalistic method with respect to the attributes of that being to either one of two ends, leading him eventually and inexorably to either one of two ends, deism or pantheism. Why? Because then there would be no room for any talk of some revelation delivered to a human prophet, or even that a maker having, or even of that maker having anything to do with our fate after death, and thus the quest of defeating the authority of religious preachers upon people would be fulfilled. Okay, a deistic deity is nothing more than an abstract entity that supposedly gives the world its raison d'etre, its cause for all causes. Okay, the abstract end of its regressive motions, as Aristotle, for example, would have it. It cannot be described as doing anything or willing anything because the abstract meaning of change was subsumed by the theory as purely and exclusively a property of composite substances that make up the world in its entirety. All right? And since to act or to do anything in its linguistic meaning can only be understood as some form of change, okay, a change from a previous state where that thing was not being done to a state where it is in fact done in time, okay? And the function of God in the theory is merely to provide the ultimate stopper for that regressive changes in motion, then he has to be himself immutable, as in it doesn't change at all, and unmoving, which in Aristotle's metaphysics would be the same as unmoved, since the very meaning of motion was reduced to being moved. Okay, as such, Aristotle would render himself intellectually justified in categorically rejecting any and all claims of divine revelation any preacher or religious of religion would invite him to accept, since he would argue that reason does not allow for a deity that actually does anything at all. Okay, and since such a maker would not even know that someone is worshipping it at all, then the very concept of religion and religious devotion would collapse. Okay, QED. Okay, it is precisely because of this Greek tradition of theorizing about all of existence as a rational prerequisite for grounding all knowledge of things that exist or happen in reality that the Salaf, the pious predecessors of scholars and A'imma in the first 3 centuries of Islam, unanimously condemned the so-called Ilm al-Kalam, or Islamic philosophical theology, because it is basically the discipline of establishing all knowledge of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and of what meanings can or cannot be reasonably attributed to Him upon some philosophical theory of existence and its metaphysical entailments as per the Greek tradition we were just describing. Okay? So instead of teaching that knowledge of reality and things that exist in reality instead of teaching that knowledge is obtained from fitrah, innate knowledge, revelation, the justification of which is founded on fitrah, of course, the senses, and from human reason, different types of analogy, as every reasonable Muslim would say, that tradition teaches that only the senses and reason provide the initial grounding for all knowledge about things that exist, and only from them, from nazar, a theory about the unseen founded somehow on input from the senses, can we learn that we do in fact have a maker who has revealed knowledge to a prophet, and thus we come to establish warrant for scripture coming from that prophet as a legitimate source of knowledge about reality, which of course would make it subservient to that theory. This is why they had to make nazar the first duty of a mukallaf, أول واجبات المكلفين, because without it, the mukallaf would be left as only a muqallid, a blind follower in belief, and just like a philosopher hates nothing more than being viewed as a follower of anybody, a mutakallim hates to be called a blind follower in belief. Okay? The warrant and justification for his being a Muslim at all thus should be founded on the kind of theory of existence and arguments therefrom that a Greek philosopher would theoretically accept and would concede to identifying as rational warrant أو تسويغ عقلاني للإيمان. Okay, what a mutakallim would fail to see, however, from whatever sect of mutakallimin he comes, is that this tradition does not give precedence and authority to the necessities of reason, as he would so fervently insist. No, it actually gives it to some metaphysical theory about existence that was not supposed to be granted approval in the first place, as a matter of principle, method, and subject matter. The very idea of postulating such a theory at such a scale and on such a subject matter, categories of existence, is an outrage and an offense. It's sophistry and an offense to the first principle of faith in Islam, belief in the unseen, al-iman bil-ghayb, because it presupposes the implicit belief that knowledge of all things, including the absolutely unobservable as in absolutely inaccessible through the senses, is attainable through a method that builds upon what is observable by the senses. A belief that is not only unwarranted and not only unwarrantable, it is manifestly false, so we contend. Not only would we object to it by asking, how do you know that things at the extreme end of the universe, for example, whatever that may be, are of the same nature as things that you know from experience here in this part of the world where your kind has lived since the first man walked this earth? How do you know that? We will not only object saying that, we actually object by insisting that proper reason to which they falsely ascribe themselves necessitates that beyond the world we know and above it, there should be the one who made it all. Okay, at the person who made it all, at the place of ultimate highness, okay, above all else that exists. So that's one place or direction where something definitely exists that does not have the nature of any of the types of matter that we know or could ever know, and does not submit to any of the laws and causal regularities that it ordained and the natures that it created. So its attributes should not be determined or negated by entailment from a theory that seeks to describe and explain all existence and all things that exist in reality, actually or potentially. Okay? We should not allow for that. And then, from the revelation of that being itself, we Muslims know for a fact that there are indeed things in this world that do not follow the laws of nature. We have learned from our experience with things we can observe. So what the earliest mutakallim should have done, but sadly failed to do, was to condemn such an outrageous tradition and its principle of theorizing about all of existence, and refrain from engaging with it on these topics in any constructive manner. However, that's not what they chose to do. Instead of revolting against their theory of knowledge and the sheer arrogance in which it treats the human mind and its cognitive faculties, and thus the very way in which it defines reason and rationality, and the way it justifies different beliefs in the unseen and the unobservable, they submitted themselves entirely and wholeheartedly to that theory, thereby ending in establishing a maker that is in reality every bit as deistic and contradictory as the maker that their teachers, the forerunners of the Greek Academy, established before them. Except they would only claim to have rational, again by the same Greek definition of rationality, rational grounds, okay, to ascribe certain attributes to that maker in accord with what the scripture says about it. Alright? They would suffer from a grave methodological contradiction in doing so, of course, as Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah managed to show elaborately in many of his books. The general implication would be that they had to deny and negate all the attributes they chose to ascribe to him if they were to follow the tradition as properly and consistently as the philosophers of old did, because they actually established those attributes despite what the tradition would have them do, not because of it as they claim. The tradition only leads to the absolute impossibility of existence of such a real entity, as opposed to abstract, of course, beyond things of this world, such things that were the subject matter of a theory that defines and explains all of time, all of space, all of motion, and ultimately all of existence. Alright? The point I'm making here, brothers and sisters, is that if you dismiss the Greek tradition in what a theory is supposed to do, and what hypothesized ontologies can apply to reality, what may or may not be, and what ontologies should not be hypothesized at all, then the entire debate of realism versus anti-realism would collapse to the ground, and you would be left with the proper way to think about the relationship between theory and reality, and the proper epistemic function, and the proper limits of what is to be called the theory of nature. Alright? Nature would then be redefined to only mean that portion of the world to which all our inductions and all our sensory experiences have only ever been confined. Okay, and we should be satisfied with that. Alright? Unlike the Greek philosopher, unlike the fathers of the Greek tradition. But theorizing about just a small sliver of reality is not acceptable to followers of that tradition. It doesn't even begin to satisfy the deontological quasi-religious purpose of a theory in their book, in their faith, in the belief system. After all, how can they ever begin? How can they even begin to accept the idea of leaving most of reality unassumed by any of their theories, untouched by any of their propositions, when they know that this would immediately leave them in ultimate need to follow those who claim to possess ultimate revealed knowledge about many of the unseen aspects of the world and what's beyond those aspects, of course, that matter the most to the human life. That tradition was invented precisely, as I hope we've managed to show and up till now, to wipe that need out of the picture altogether for the philosopher. No philosopher would accept the idea of having to be a follower in belief, no matter what or why. He has to question everything, at least potentially, to be worthy of the title, and he needs to adopt a theory of all things that exist if he wishes to be given any form of intellectual credit whatsoever. So following that miserable tradition, all philosophers had a profound existential problem with their maker, literally. He is essentially something that simultaneously should and should not be part of their theory, and thereby of existence. Okay? The theory might need to appeal to the existence of some abstract maker or mover that transcends all meanings that can apply by the theory to things that actually exist in reality in an attempt to avoid regress. But it would also need to dismiss it altogether, since by definition the maker of the world cannot be of the same nature or category of existence as the world itself and its substance, and cannot partake of meanings that apply to it. Okay, thus, so absolute deism would appear to be an appealing option. In fact, it would mostly appear to be the only way out of that problem. Some philosophers, however, circumvented the problem altogether by allowing for a regress of causes to have happened, and thereby assigned all meanings of lordship and generation of the world to the world itself, or to some features of it, in a fundamentally pantheistic approach, as adopted by Newton, Spinoza, Einstein, and others, of course, while claiming that no abstract superfluous maker is required to end anything or explain anything. Okay, it just happens as it is, the way it is, and has been happening forever, and that's it. The cosmos is all there is all there ever was, and all there ever will be, to quote Carl Sagan on that matter. They would opt to a metaphysical definition of cause that would make it a physical property of matter and energy in this world alone, that does not apply to anything beyond, since there can be nothing beyond it anyway. Okay, in other words, only something of this world, made of the types of matter we already know, can be said to cause or to be caused at all, because only things as such can in fact exist at all. Now, no rational necessity would justify either of the two paths, or prefer it over the other, or make it more plausible in any sense, since the very notion of all existence being subject to some theory is fundamentally irrational in the first place, irrational and unacceptable, okay, unwarranted. So what did Newton do? His literature would suggest three different manners by which he related his maker to the world. Alright? Some critics would say he adopted an interdependent relation between space and time and God. Others would claim him to have observed a relation of causation, as in the sense of an emerging theory or emergence theory. Both space and time are constantly emerging from God. And a third group would have him ascribing both space and time as attributes to his maker. Okay? At one instance, he writes that although God is not duration and space, he is not those things, he nevertheless constitutes these by existing always and everywhere. Constitutes them? What does that even mean? Okay, in other words, if space and time are real, exist as things outside of the mind, and they are everywhere and always, then either God would only exist within that thing as part of it, which obviously tarnishes the character of the maker of all things as taught by the church, or would exist in some form of conjunction or overlap with that thing that he calls space, okay, and time, of course, because the third option, being outside of it all, is dismissed, since space and time, he would hold, are infinite and absolute. They're everywhere and all the time, and always. So what does it even mean for him to constitute space and time, since they both exist everywhere and always, as he does, as the Lord, as the Creator himself does? Samuel Clarke, Newton's faithful student, explains in a letter to Leibniz that space is not a substance, but rather a property of that which is necessary. And of course, Leibniz, by the way, had a long debate with Clarke about the nature of space and time. Leibniz, despite being raised upon the Greek tradition, somehow opted to believe that space and time are actually relational. They're only relations that our minds build about things that happen in reality and that exist in reality. They're not actually out there in existence. Okay, he believed that, but of course he followed the Greek tradition in pretty much everything else. Okay, but he had a famous debate with Clarke, and they had correspondences famously back and forth between them on this issue and other things. So Clarke told him that this is what Newton believed, and this is what they believed about how gods related to time and space. Obviously, if God is necessary, he must have always been there somewhere. Then the very notion of space and time must have also always been there, applying to him at least. Okay? But Newton did, in fact, maintain that space and time were indeed two absolute entities existing outside of the mind, في الأعيان. Okay? خارج الذهن. Independent of the existence of other things, in the same manner that is now thought of the so-called space-time, as we might be coming back to in later lectures. So in short, Newton's problem with God was that he was a devout believer in the existence of a personal God who created everything and who's sustaining everything, keeping everything as it is, and who will reward the believers in the afterlife. And yet his metaphysics simply left no room for him to exist outside of the very world he is credited for creating. After all, if space and time are absolute infinite things according to the theory, things that have always been there everywhere, all the time, then the only viable option, as we've discussed, would be to say that wherever there is space and time, there is God, and whenever there is God, there is space and time. And space and time, according to his characterization, are real things in reality outside of the mind, which had the very bad consequence of rendering other things equally necessary to him in existence. Okay, so the only way out of that, it seemed, was to make space, where all created things exist, an actual intrinsic attribute of God. Okay, thereby opting to a pantheistic belief. All things are parts of God or attributes of his, one way or another. Okay, God is everything, in short. Einstein, on the other hand, didn't struggle much with the issue of divine attributes, although he was raised into a Jewish family. He never really was a Jew. So when his metaphysics came to fruition, he didn't shy away from openly ridiculing the very idea, the very notion of a personal God who answers people's prayers, listens to their thoughts, heals the sick, and feeds the hungry, etc. Okay, and afterwards would resurrect them all from the dead and judge them. The general sentiment in the academy was that the philosophical maker, the abstract maker of the Greeks, of the Greek fathers of the academy, was way more elegant and more rational and more in style, so to speak, than the personal God embraced by followers of the so-called theistic religions. Obviously, it seemed to satisfy the very reason why all the big questions about the world at its entirety were made into the subject matter of philosophical consideration and deliberation. After all, if God would not choose me, the master philosopher, to be his messenger to the world and to acquire that seat of ultimate authority upon people's minds and hearts, then I have no choice but to bring down the temple. Literally. Then I might as well champion a major theory that would effectively pull the rug from underneath every prophet who ever claims to have that privilege under the sun. Wallahu musta'an, wala hawla wala quwwata illa billah.
قناة إقناع فيما نرجو.
سحابة خير أمطرت على أرض جرداء
تحمل من كل زوجين اثنين،
المؤمن والملحد،
الضال والمهتدي،
الموقن والشاك،
فأنبتت بما تحمله من ماء الحياة حيث نصوص الوحيين
ثمار اليقين في قلوب المؤمنين،
وصقلت بذات الماء قلوب المعاندين.